The silence came first. Not the quiet of a forest settling after a long autumn day. Not the measured hush of birds and insects moving from their daytime habits to their nighttime ones. What came down from the northern tree line on the fourth night was something that had weight and presence, a silence that pressed against the ears from the outside in, that had taken the place of sound rather than simply following it. The horses understood it before any of us did. They were standing with their heads up and their ears rigid when I came out of the tent, and the one that had been watching the tree line since the second evening had pulled its stake clean out of the ground and was pressed against the southern creek bank, as far from the tree line as the hollow allowed. The fire had been burning for 3 hours. There was no wind. There was no reason for the silence. By the time I understood what it was, Iosif Petre was already separated from us, and all of us were running, and the thing that had come through the wall of the cook shelter was somewhere in the camp behind us. My name is Vasile Munteanu. I am writing this account in a rented room above the railway station in Turda on the 20th of October, 1923, 6 days after we assembled in Cluj to begin the expedition, and 2 days after 5 of us walked out of the forest onto the road east of Company. I am writing it now, before the formal inquest, because I cannot sleep, and because the act of writing is the only arrangement of events that holds still long enough for me to examine. An inquest will come. I will speak at it carefully, and I will answer every question I am asked. But this is a different kind of record, a private one, and it is being set down because I owe it to what happened to put it somewhere outside my own head. I have been a licensed hunting guide in the Apuseni region of Transylvania for 8 years. Before that, I trained in forestry at the Institute in Cluj and spent 2 seasons as a ranger's assistant in the Bucegi Mountains. I know these forests in the way that a working professional knows them, not through sentiment or tradition, but through sustained practical observation over a long time. I know the animals and their habits, and the sounds they produce, and the signs they leave. I know what disturbed terrain looks like, and what resting terrain looks like, and I know the difference between them at a glance. I know what a forest sounds like when it is empty, and I know what it sounds like when something large is moving through it. In 8 years and more than 40 expeditions, I have encountered nothing I could not name. What I encountered in the foothills east of Company between the 14th and 17th of October, 1923, is something I cannot name. I can describe it. That is what this document attempts. One other thing I want to record at the outset. Iosif Petre's knife. He wore it on his belt through the entire expedition, a Solingen folding blade with a wooden handle, which he had shown me on the first morning and spoken about with pride because it had been a gift from his father on the occasion of passing his military service. That knife was on his belt when we ran. I saw it there as we crossed the camp in the dark toward the creek. When we found it embedded in the pine trunk at the road's edge the following morning, the blade was bent at 40 degrees from the handle, and the wood of the tree had already begun to close around it, as if it had been there for some time. I have no explanation for this. I have the knife on the table beside this lamp. I cannot put it down, which is a thing I also cannot explain. I want to record everything in the order in which it happened, as precisely as I can manage. The hunting party assembled in Cluj on the morning of the 14th of October. My clients were 4 men from Bucharest, all connected through the kinds of relationships that form between men of similar backgrounds in the same city over many years of commerce and proximity. Radu Ciobanu was the man who had arranged the expedition. He was a textile manufacturer in his mid-40s, heavy through the shoulders and chest, with the particular authority of a man who has been decisive and correct so many times that he has stopped distinguishing between confidence and certainty. He had hunted with me twice before, in 1921 and 1922, and he was not a bad client. He moved well in the field. He listened when it mattered. He paid in full and on time. His difficulty, as I had learned across 2 previous expeditions, was a fixed expectation of how any given situation should proceed, and a tendency to experience deviation from that expectation as a personal challenge requiring a response. This quality was going to cost us something on this expedition. I did not know that then. Marian Stancu was perhaps 50, a quiet man who held some administrative position with the National Railway, and who carried in his body the residue of military service as clearly as if he had never taken the uniform off. He moved efficiently and without waste. He spoke rarely, and when he spoke it was direct and brief. He handled his rifle the way men handle things they have used under pressure, without performance, without flourish. I trusted him from the first afternoon, and the fourth night confirmed what I had assessed in the first hour. Petru Filipescu dealt in wine and had the build of a man who sampled his inventory with more than professional regularity. He was perhaps 42, broad and genial, someone who filled whatever space he was in with comfortable noise. He laughed easily and told stories with pleasure, and was, on the first 2 days of the expedition, exactly the kind of client who makes the evenings around the fire pleasant and uncomplicated. His response to what happened, on the fourth night, I am going to record without judgment. Fear is not something a man chooses. Iosif Petra was 27 years old, a nephew of Ciobanu's, a young man from Bucharest who worked in his uncle's textile business, and who had come on this expedition as a gift from that uncle on the occasion of his engagement. He had never hunted boar. He had never spent more than a single night in any forest. He came with the bright, uncautious energy of a man who has been competent at everything he has tried and expects this to be the same. But there was something else in him as well, something that I noticed in the first hours of the expedition and that grew more apparent across the days that followed. He paid attention in a particular way, patient and unhurried and genuinely curious, the attention of someone who is actually interested in what the world is rather than in confirming what he already expected. He recorded things in a small leather notebook he kept in his coat pocket. He asked questions that demonstrated he had understood the previous answer. I have guided young men on expeditions who wore their inexperience as an excuse for not trying. Iosif wore it as a reason to observe carefully. He was going to be very good at this, given the chance. The fifth member of the party was Gheorghe Lazar, a local man from Campeni who had served as camp cook and auxiliary guide on 2 previous expeditions with me into the Apuseni foothills. Gheorghe was 51, broad through the chest and shoulders, deliberate in all his movements in the way that physically capable people sometimes are when they have learned they don't need to hurry. He knew this terrain as well as any man I have worked with in this region. His grandmother had been born in a hill village above Campeni, called Poiana Vaduli, a settlement that no longer exists as a living community, but that appears on the older survey maps of the area. From his grandmother, and from the broader oral inheritance of the Apuseni hill communities, Gheorghe carried a complete and practical knowledge of the traditional life of these forests. He did not apologize for this knowledge, did not preface it with disclaimers about the modern world, or qualify it out of deference to clients from the city. He knew what he knew, and he said what he knew, and he was, across 2 previous expeditions and the beginning of this one, correct about the things he spoke about with confidence. I will come to what Gheorghe told me on the evening of the second night. I am not going to abbreviate it. We drove south from Cluj in 2 vehicles on the morning of the 14th. The clients traveled in Ciobanu's automobile, a large and well-maintained machine that held 4 men comfortably. The equipment, the canvas tents, the cook supplies, the ammunition, the food stores, the extra rope and tools traveled in a rented supply truck with a hired driver. Gheorghe rode with the equipment and the driver. I rode with the clients. We arrived at the edge of Campeni by early afternoon. I had planned to pass through quickly, collecting Gheorghe and the supply truck from where I had arranged to meet them at the south end of the village, and to reach the campsite with sufficient daylight for a proper setup before dark. Ciobanu wanted to stop at the inn for coffee and a meal. The stop was not unreasonable by any standard I could have articulated, and so we stopped. The inn was quiet in the early afternoon, and largely empty. We settled at a long table, and the innkeeper brought coffee and a simple meal. Gheorghe arrived at the inn separately from where he had been arranging the horses at a farm on the south edge of the village, and he came in and stopped when he saw the man at the window table. The man was a priest. He was perhaps 65, thin, with the indoor complexion of someone who spends most of his life working at a desk or in a church interior, and he was seated at a table near the window as if he had been expecting someone. When Gerge came in, the priest rose and crossed to him and spoke in a low voice. I watched them from the long table without being able to hear the exchange clearly. It lasted perhaps 3 minutes. The priest was unhurried, and Gerge listened with the same unhurried patience he brought to everything. Whatever passed between them, it produced in Gerge a specific shift in posture that I noticed without quite identifying at the time. When Gerge came to the table, he said that the priest wanted to give each man an icon before we left, a folded paper icon from the church, and that we should accept them. Ciobanu's response was brief and dismissive, not hostile, just the automatic response of a Bucharest man to what he classified as provincial ceremony that did not apply to him. Filipescu shrugged pleasantly. Marian Stancu looked at Gerge with an expression I couldn't read clearly, then nodded once. I said we would take the icons. The priest gave them at the door of the inn as we were leaving, pressing each folded square into each man's hands with both of his own and holding the hands for a moment. As he gave each icon, he spoke quietly. I was close enough to hear most of what he said, and what I heard was not the blessing I had expected. He said, "Stay together in the camp once you have made it. Keep the fire strong through each night, and if you must move in the dark, keep moving. Do not stand still in the forest after dark. Movement is better than stillness." He said this to each man. Then he stood at the door and watched us go. I remember looking back from the vehicle window as we drove south, and seeing him still standing at the door of the inn, watching the road. The campsite was a creek, clearing in a natural hollow 3 kilometers east of Campanie, and roughly 5 kilometers from the deepest part of the northern forest. I had used this site on 3 previous expeditions and selected it for the creek along its southern edge, which provided reliable water and a natural perimeter break, and for the shape of the hollow itself, which kept the wind manageable and made fire building practical. The pine forest came down close on the north and east, perhaps 30 meters from the northernmost tent when the camp was properly arranged. Gerge and I struck the tents while the clients organized their gear, a division of labor we had established on previous expeditions, and that proceeded without discussion. Iosif helped from the first minute, lifting and carrying and asking where things should go, and then doing what he was told. It is a small thing to note in a hunting guide's journal, the willingness of a client to help in camp, but it is not a small thing in practice. It tells you something about how a man will behave when conditions become difficult. The horses arrived with the supply truck, 2 animals rented from a farm outside Campanie. They were experienced horses, accustomed to hunting camps and the routines of them, and they settled quickly at the southern edge of the camp, near the creek where I hobbled them. I noted their calm and thought nothing more of it. Gerge built the fire well, as he always did, and we ate that first evening with the fire at full strength and the cold pressing in around its edge, and the stars above the hollow remarkable in their density and clarity. The talk was the talk of any first night in hunting camp. Ciobanu described the boar population of the Apuseni based on reports from other guides, several of which were inaccurate, but none of which I corrected, because correcting a client's misinformation about game population on the first night of an expedition is a poor investment. Marian Stancu asked me several specific questions about terrain and access points, and distances to the eastern reaches of the forest. Filipescu told a story about a hunting expedition in Wallachia that was probably not entirely true, but was told well. Iosif listened to everything and wrote in his notebook by the firelight, and once, when Marian Stancu described a specific feature of the eastern forest terrain that I had also noted, looked up and caught my eye with an expression of recognition that suggested he had been paying closer attention to the landscape on the drive-in than I had expected. I sat at the fire for a while after the others had gone to their tents, and I thought, specifically and clearly, that this was a good camp and a good night, and that the expedition was well begun. I wrote exactly that in this journal, a good camp and a good first night. Nothing happened on the first night. I recorded this as well. It is relevant later. The second day was the best boar hunting I had experienced in the Apuseni in 3 years. We were in the forest before dawn, and Marian Stancu took a boar of approximately 90 kilograms with a single clean shot at 40 meters, which is not easy work, in that terrain where the light is bad and the distances are compressed by undergrowth. He did it with the efficiency of someone who had done this or something very like it many times before. Ciobanu took a smaller animal by midday. Filipescu shot at something and missed it, and received this information with more grace than I expected. Iosif observed all of this from close proximity, watching technique and positioning and the way the other men read the forest, with the notebook unavailable to him in the field, but clearly running in his head. When I pointed out tracks mid-morning, he crouched beside me and looked at them seriously, asking what told me they were recent rather than from the previous day. I explained, and he thought about the explanation, and later in the afternoon he pointed out a second set of tracks on his own and told me what he read from them. He was mostly right. We dressed the boar in the field and brought the meat back to camp by early afternoon. Gergely began the long process of proper preparation. The clients cleaned their rifles and rested. I walked the camp perimeter as I do at the end of every active hunting day, checking the ground and the tree line and the condition of the camp's edges. At the southern edge, along the creek, I found deer tracks in the soft mud. 4 or 5 deer had come to the water during the day while we were in the forest. The tracks were clear and recent and ordinary. Deer coming to a water source in an active forest, nothing unusual. Except that alongside the deer tracks, there was something else. A depression in the mud, roughly oval, approximately 40 centimeters at its longest dimension, and the soil around it was disturbed in a way that made a clean reading difficult. I spent several minutes looking at it from different angles and in different light. It was not the track of any animal I knew in the Apuseni foothills. Not the right size for boar, wrong shape for bear, wrong for deer, wrong for wolf, wrong for any other animal native to this forest system. Something had made this impression, and I could not tell what it was. I told myself it was a deer track that had collapsed or been distorted by water movement or by the step of a second deer overlapping the first at an angle. I told myself this because it was the most available explanation and because I was not yet in the place where I would consider other explanations seriously. I did not show it to Gergely that afternoon. I should have. The second evening, as we were eating, I heard the nearer of the 2 horses shift weight at the south edge of the camp. I turned and found the animal standing with its head up and its ears forward, looking at the northern tree line with fixed attention. The horse's partner was also standing, also looking north, both animals quiet, but intensely focused on something in the darkening tree line that I could not see. When I turned back to the fire, Gergely was watching me, not the horses. Me. His expression was controlled and gave nothing away. But I had worked with Gergely on 2 previous expeditions, and I knew the difference between his ordinary composure and his managing what he feels composure, and this was the second kind. After dinner, when Ciobanu and Filipescu had retired, and Iosif was writing in his notebook by the last of the fire, Gergely and I sat together and he talked. He spoke Romanian, which among the clients only Marian Stancu had sufficient command of to follow, and Marian Stancu was already in his tent, so this was a private conversation. He told me about Poiana Vaduli, his grandmother's village, 12 kilometers northeast of where we were camped. He told me the people of Poiana Vaduli had maintained a specific relationship with a section of forest between the village and the Arieș River for as long as any living person could trace through the memories of the previous generation. The relationship was defined by a boundary and a rule. The village did not enter that section of forest between sunset and sunrise, and in exchange, the thing that lived in that forest did not enter the village. The boundary was not marked in any way that a stranger would recognize. It was known through the particular alignment of certain rock formations and the way the water moved in a specific section of the creek, known by people who had been taught it, by people who had been taught it before them. The rule was not written anywhere. It was simply maintained, the way certain things are maintained in communities where the alternative to maintaining them is understood. I asked what the thing was. He used the old word, Strigoi. He paused before he used it, the way he always paused before he said something he knew might be received with skepticism, giving himself a moment to decide whether to say it plainly or to find a more modern accommodation. He decided on plainly. He said he was not using the word the way city people used it, to mean a revenant spirit, something that existed between the living and the dead in a metaphysical sense. He was using it the way his grandmother had used it, which was to describe something that had physical existence in the world, that could be seen and heard and touched, that consumed and that moved through the physical environment, leaving physical evidence. Something old, something that operated according to its own logic, rather than the logic of living animals. Something that enforced a territory with what his grandmother described as a proportional response. If you came in briefly and left without harm to what the territory contained, you might receive only a warning, something to make clear that you had been seen and that you were on notice. If you stayed, if you took things, if you treated the territory as yours rather than as something you were permitted to pass through, the response was of a different order. I asked him what kind of thing it ate. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he didn't think eating was the right description of what it was motivated by. He said his grandmother's accounts described something that acted out of territorial logic rather than predatory hunger. It responded to intrusion. It enforced a boundary. Whether the enforcement was about hunger or about something older and less nameable, the outcome for the people on the wrong side of the enforcement was the same. He told me the thing that had been sitting in my head since I found the unclear impression at the creek. He said the farmer at the horse rental had told him, when they collected the animals that morning, that the deer had cleared out of this section of the foothills 3 days before we arrived. Not gradually, not the normal seasonal movement, but all at once, one morning, as if a collective decision had been made. The farmer said he had seen this happen before, in this specific section of the Apuseni, always in the same general area, and he considered it a reliable indicator of something that he could name in the old language but that he didn't go looking for. I listened to all of this. I have always respected what Gerge told me, because Gerge was not a foolish man, and had never, across 2 previous expeditions, told me something about this forest that turned out to be wrong. But I was also a trained forestry professional in the 2nd decade of the 20th century, and the distance between what I could professionally accept and what Gerge was describing was significant. I held his account in the in-between place, where things go when you can't discard them, but aren't ready to act on them. I asked him if he thought the campsite was inside the boundary he was describing. He said he thought we might be on the edge of it, or inside it, and that he didn't know the exact position of the boundary in relation to our camp, only that the creek his grandmother's accounts mentioned as a boundary marker was the same creek we were camped beside, which was not a comfortable coincidence. I asked what we should do. He said we should leave in the morning. I said I would think about it. He looked at me for a moment, and then said that he knew I would not leave in the morning, and that he understood why, but that he wanted to be precise about what he was recommending, so that later, neither of us would be uncertain about what had been said. He was recommending that we strike camp at first light and return to Company. I went to bed. I did not sleep well. This was the first night I did not sleep well. The 3rd day was ordinary through its daylight hours, which is a thing I keep returning to when I try to understand the shape of the events. The 3rd day's hunting was excellent. We were in the forest before dawn, and by mid-morning, Iosif had his first boar, a clean shot, smaller than Stanku's animal from the previous day, but taken with a composed patience that surprised me, and produced in Marian Stanku a brief, quiet commendation that was the closest I heard him come to enthusiasm. Iosif was pleased with himself in the particular way of someone who has accomplished something they were not certain they could accomplish, and I was glad for him. Filipescu missed again, more significantly than on the previous days, and this time put his rifle down and did not offer to shoot again, which I took as a sign of developing self-awareness. We returned to camp by mid-afternoon, and Gerge began preparing the evening meal, and the day was ordinary. It was at approximately 7:15 in the evening that the sound began. I am going to try to describe it precisely, because it is the thing most central to what happened, and because imprecision about it would be a failure of this document's purpose. It was not a howl. It was not a vocalization of the kind any animal native to these forests produces. It was a tone, a sustained low-frequency tone that reached me first, not as something my ears detected, but as something my chest felt. A vibration in the sternum, subtle at first, like the resonance you sense when you are near a very large bell that has been struck and is still ringing. Then, once I became aware of the vibration in my chest, I became aware of it as sound, a low, continuous tone at the very bottom of the range where sound becomes felt rather than heard, coming from the direction of the northern tree line. The horses responded to it before I consciously named what I was hearing. The nearer horse, the one that had been watching the tree line on the previous evening, began to shake, not to move, not to pull against its hobble, but to shake, in the whole body, on all four legs, a fine continuous trembling that I have seen in horses that have been brought into direct proximity with a large predator and are managing their fear at the edge of panic. The second horse matched it within seconds. I looked at the northern tree line. I could see nothing in the growing dark. The sound continued. Chobanu heard it and said it was probably an eagle owl, which is native to the region and capable of unusual vocalizations. He said this in the tone of a man providing information rather than an explanation, as if naming a possible source resolved the question of what the sound meant. I did not contradict him. I had worked in these forests for 8 years, and I knew every vocalization, every owl in the Apuseni was capable of producing, and this was not one of them. But I did not say so, because I was not yet ready to say what I thought it was. Marian Stanku said nothing. He moved to the northern edge of the firelight and stood there looking at the tree line with the still attention that I had come to recognize as his form of heightened awareness. His rifle was in the tent. He did not go to it, but he was standing between the fire and the tent in a way that I did not think was accidental. Gerge went into his tent when the sound began. I found him there when it stopped, sitting on his bedroll with the paper icon held in both hands. He looked at me when I came in, and I asked him what he thought. He said he thought it was announcing itself, making sure that we understood it was aware of us, that we had been seen, that the question of what to do about us was open and being considered. He said his grandmother had described a sound like this as something that happened once or twice before the thing decided how to respond to a presence in its territory, a warning that was also a preparation. He said we should not be here in the morning. I told him again that I would think about it. He said, "Vasile, I have told you what I think, and I have told you why. I am telling you now that I will not tell you again because it is not my decision to make. Whatever you decide, I will be here. I am telling you what I know." I went back to the fire. Chobanu and Filipescu had gone to their tents. Iosif was sitting at the fire with his hands around a cup. He said, "Gerge is frightened." I said yes. He said, "Are you?" I said I was cautious, which was not entirely accurate. The sound had done something to my body that went beyond caution, a physical settling of unease in the chest and stomach that I was managing, but that I could not entirely suppress. I said I was cautious, and I believed that was sufficient for the night. The sound came again at 2 in the morning. I came awake to it and lay still in the tent and listened. It was louder than the dusk occurrence, by a margin that I estimated at perhaps 30%, and it lasted approximately 20 minutes, and there was a quality in it on this second occurrence that the first had not had. The first time, it had seemed to come from a fixed point in the tree line. On this second occurrence, the pitch varied over the 20 minutes in a pattern that was consistent with a source moving, slowly, while producing the sound. Not moving dramatically, not approaching, but circling at some distance, the variations in pitch corresponding to the varying angle between a moving source and a fixed listener. I lay in the dark and held myself still and controlled my breathing and did not go out. I had the rifle beside me. I did not pick it up. When the sound stopped, I lay in the dark for a long time. I went through the list of reasons to leave in the morning and the reasons to stay. The reasons to leave were longer. I told myself I would assess in the morning and make a decision based on what the morning showed. Gerge found the tracks before anyone else was awake. He came to my tent at first light and did not speak, only stood at the tent entrance in a way that communicated urgency without alarm. I came out and followed him to the ground between the cook shelter and the northern tree line, approximately 8 meters from the camp edge. The tracks were clear and deep, and they ran in a straight line from the tree line to within 8 meters of the cook shelter, and then turned and returned to the trees. 6 prints in total. The stride was approximately 90 centimeters between prints. I am going to describe the prints themselves once and without elaboration. They were of a broadly human shape but 30 centimeters in length, and the toes, 5 of them, were long and widely spaced in a manner inconsistent with any human foot or with the foot of any animal I knew in the Apuseni foothills. And at the terminus of each toe was a deep, sharp impression corresponding to a claw or nail of significant length. The weight that produced these prints was very great. The depth of the impression in ground, that was not particularly soft, indicated something considerably heavier than a man of comparable foot size would produce. 6 prints, approaching to 8 meters, stopping, returning. I measured the distance from the nearest print to the cook shelter, 8 meters. Then I measured the distance from the fire pit to where I was standing. The fire, at full evening strength, cast useful light approximately 8 to 10 meters from its center. Whatever made these tracks had stopped at the edge of the fire's illumination zone. Marian Stancu came out of his tent, and he came to where Gerge and I were standing, and he looked at the tracks for a long time without speaking. Then he went back to the tent and came out with both rifles and set about cleaning them, which was not something that needed doing. It was something that gave his hands an occupation while he thought. Iosif came out and crouched at the nearest print and examined it with his characteristic, careful attention. He measured the stride with his forearm. He looked at the line of approach from the tree line to the stopping point. He said, "It stopped at the edge of the firelight." I said, "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "It didn't want to be seen." Gerge, without looking up from where he was crouching, said, "Not yet." We did not hunt that 4th day. Chobanu proposed it, with less conviction than on previous days, and Marian Stancu laid the larger of the 2 cleaned rifles across his knees and looked at Chobanu without speaking, and the proposal was not advanced further. The argument about the trap line began in the early afternoon. I had set 4 snare traps on the 2nd day along a game trail 200 meters into the northern forest, a standard supplementary practice for a multi-day camp. Iosif had helped me set them and had the positions recorded in his notebook. On the afternoon of the 4th day, after the morning of the tracks, and the long tense midday in which no one spoke much, and the fire that Gerge had built very large, began to feel like the only reasonable boundary between the camp and everything beyond it, Iosif said someone should check the traps. I said no. He said the traps needed to be checked, that leaving them unattended was wasteful and potentially harmful to what might be caught in them, and that 200 meters in full afternoon daylight with rifles was not an unreasonable proposition. I said no again. Chobanu said he agreed with Iosif. He said the group was becoming paralyzed by events that had not yet constituted actual harm, and that 2 men going 200 meters and back in broad daylight was a rational action, compared to sitting at the camp all afternoon becoming more afraid. He said they would be gone 20 minutes at most. Filipescu, who had eaten very little at midday and who had been looking at the tree line more than at anything else all morning, said that he would go with Iosif. This surprised me. He did not look like a man who wanted to go anywhere near the forest. I looked at Marian Stancu. Marian Stancu looked at Iosif. He looked at the tree line. He looked at me. Then he looked back at Iosif and said, 200 meters directly to the traps and directly back. Don't stop anywhere else. Don't separate. I said Filipescu would go with him, that they would stay together, and that if anything at all felt wrong, they would come back immediately without the rabbits or whatever was in the traps. And so they went. I stood at the camp edge and watched them until the tree line took them, and then I stood there and listened to the forest. The forest was very quiet, which I did not like. I held my watch in my hand. They were gone 11 minutes. I know this precisely. They came back through the tree line with 2 rabbits, Iosif carrying them by the feet with the expression of a man who has demonstrated that his position in an argument was correct. Filipescu was behind him, and he was walking faster than the situation required, as if he was managing the impulse to walk considerably faster than that. I asked Filipescu what had happened in the forest. He said, nothing had happened. The traps were fine. 2 rabbits. They had come straight back. I looked at his face when he said this. His face was not saying nothing happened, but I did not press it. That evening, Filipescu drank considerably more than on previous evenings and went to bed before the sound began. The sound on the 4th evening started at 43 minutes past 7, which I wrote in this journal at the time, because the earlier onset was something I noted. More than 30 minutes earlier than the 3rd evening. And it was louder from the first moment than it had been on any previous occurrence. Not gradually louder, but immediately louder, as if what had been a moderate demonstration on previous nights was no longer the appropriate register. And it was moving. I understood this over the first 15 minutes. The pitch was not constant, as it had been in the dusk occurrences on the 2nd and 3rd nights. It shifted continuously, not randomly but in a pattern. The pattern of something circling the camp at a distance of perhaps 40 or 50 meters from the perimeter, moving through the tree line in a slow, deliberate arc, the variations in pitch consistent with the changing angle between a moving source and fixed listeners. Moving in one direction around the perimeter, then slowing, then moving back, then pausing, then forward again. I did not say this aloud. After perhaps 10 minutes, Marian Stancu looked at me from across the fire, and I looked back at him, and I understood that he had also been tracking the pattern. He held my gaze for a moment, and then looked back at the tree line. The horses were beyond managing. The horse that had been hobbled near the creek pulled its stake for the first time at approximately 8 in the evening, and I had to go and restake it. It was soaked with sweat and shaking with such force that I could feel the vibration in the stake through my palms when I drove it back into the ground. I restaked it twice more in the next hour. The second horse stood against the creek bank and pressed its shoulder against the earth embankment and did not move from that position. Ciobanu sat at the fire with his rifle across his knees and did not speak. His face was controlled in the way that faces are controlled when the effort of controlling them is significant. Gerga held the paper icon and looked at the fire. Marian Stancu stood at the northern edge of the firelight. Iosif sat beside me and did not speak for some time. Then he said, very quietly, "It is circling us." I said I thought so. He said, "How long has it known we were here?" I said probably since before we arrived, possibly since the deer left. He absorbed this. Then he said, "What does it want?" I knew what it wanted. It wanted us to leave. It had been indicating this for 3 nights, and we had not left, and now it had moved from indicating to something else. I did not say this out loud because saying it clearly would have required me to also say that I had made the wrong decision on the 2nd evening when Gerga advised me to go and I had decided to stay. And I was not prepared to say that at the fire, with Iosif beside me and the thing circling in the darkness. The sound continued for approximately an hour. When it stopped, the silence that came after it was qualitatively different from the silences on previous nights. Closer, more occupied. Marian Stancu organized us into a watch rotation. 2 men awake and at the fire at all times. The fire kept at full strength. The rifles near each man who was sleeping. I took the first watch with Gergi. The camp was quiet for the first watch, and I woke Ciobanu and Marian Stancu at midnight and went to my tent. I was nearly asleep when Gergi opened the tent flap. He said only, "Inside the perimeter." I came out of the tent immediately. The camp looked as it had when I went in. The fire coals at medium strength, the tents in their positions, the cook shelter to the northwest. Ciobanu was at the fire, sitting upright, with the rifle. Gergely was pointing with his chin toward the cook shelter. The canvas wall of the cook shelter was moving. No wind. The canvas was being pressed from the outside, steadily, rhythmically, not violently, in the slow, deliberate cadence of something pressing with each step as it walked along the exterior of the structure. Pressing on the east wall, moving to the south wall, pressing and releasing, pressing and releasing. I woke Marian Stancu, and he came out of the tent already oriented and already reaching for the rifle, and he scanned the camp in a single practiced sweep. Iosif came out of the other tent with his rifle loaded, which meant he had loaded it before sleeping. I went to Filipescu's tent. He was awake, pressed against the far wall of the tent with his knees drawn up. I told him to come out. He came out. The pressing against the canvas was moving, east wall to south wall, and now to the west wall, moving in the same direction it had been circling the camp in from outside. Marian Stancu raised his rifle, and I put my hand on the barrel and pushed it down, not because I thought it was the wrong response, but because I wanted to understand what we were dealing with before we changed the nature of the encounter by shooting at it. I understand now that this was an error in reasoning. The nature of the encounter had already changed when it came through the perimeter. The pressing against the west wall of the cook shelter stopped. The camp was completely still. The canvas of the south wall of the cook shelter tore from shoulder height to the ground in a single smooth motion, not explosively, slowly and deliberately, as if a single finger were drawn down the face of the canvas from top to bottom with measured pressure. The tear was perhaps 40 centimeters wide at its base. Through it, I could see into the interior of the shelter, in the light of the fire coals, the hanging pots, the bundled smoked meat, Gergely's wooden stool, the ordinary objects of a camp kitchen. And then, in the opening of the tier, I saw the hand. It gripped the canvas at the edge of the tier. The grip was slow and deliberate, and the fingers closed around the canvas with a precision that communicated intention rather than impulse. What I saw, I have already described at the outset of this document, and I will not describe further. It gripped the canvas, and it pulled, widening the tier from 40 centimeters to the full width of the south wall, and the interior of the cook shelter was fully open. Iosif said one word. He said the name of God. Marian Stancu raised his rifle, and this time I did not stop him. The shot was enormous. It struck the canvas at the opening and passed through, and I heard it go into the tree line beyond the camp. The grip on the canvas released. The canvas fell. And then the hum was in the camp itself. Not from the tree line, not from outside the perimeter, from the space between the cook shelter and the tents. In the darkness between structures, at a proximity that was not 40 meters, or 20 meters, or 10 meters, but close enough that I felt the vibration in my teeth and in the bones of my hands. Ciobanu stood from the fire. He said, "We are leaving now." I said yes. Gergely said, "Move south through the creek, and then east along it to the road. Stay together. Move without lanterns. Keep moving." Marian Stancu fired again, into the space between the cook shelter and the tents where the hum was concentrated. The shot was followed by something that was not an echo, a sharp exhalation of sound from that direction, not pain, not retreat, something that communicated more clearly than any language could have, that the thing producing it was aware of what we were doing and was responding. Marian Stancu stepped backward 2 steps and said, "Move now." We ran for the creek. The creek crossing I remember in fragments. The cold of the water above my knees, the softness of the creek bed underfoot, the difficulty of maintaining footing while moving fast in the dark. Gergely's shoulder ahead of me, the tree line on the far bank becoming close, my boot catching on a root as I climbed the far bank, and my hands going into the cold mud. I was 5 meters into the eastern trees when I stopped. I turned back toward the creek. I could see the fire coals of the camp, orange in the dark. I could see the damaged cook shelter. I could not see the space between the tents. I could not see Iosif. Ciobanu came through the water and up the bank. Then Filipescu, moving quickly. Then Marian Stancu, moving backward with the rifle still raised. I said, "Where is Iosif?" No answer. I said again, "Where is Iosif?" Marian Stancu looked back at the creek. He looked at me. His face in the dark said something, but I could not read it. Chobanu said, "He was right behind you at the water. He crossed. He must be ahead of us." I looked at the dark trees in front of me. I looked at the creek behind me. The hum was in the camp still, not following yet. Marian Stancu said, "He is ahead. Keep moving. I want to record this precisely." I chose to believe them, not because I had any evidence that Iosif had crossed the creek ahead of me, but because I was afraid, because the hum was still audible from the camp and had not yet begun to move toward us, and because the alternative to believing them was to go back into the dark and the camp alone. I chose to believe them. We moved east along the creek for approximately 2 hours. Gergely led, and he moved in the dark with confidence, knowing the terrain, and we did not use lanterns because a lantern in those trees would have made us visible for a significant distance, and we did not want to be visible. Filipescu fell twice. The second time, Chobanu pulled him up and kept a hand on his arm for the rest of the walk. The hum followed us in the forest for perhaps 30 minutes, audible but not closer, and then it fell below the level I could hear, and the ordinary sounds of the forest, the small movements of nighttime animals in the undergrowth, the wind in the upper branches, returned slowly around us, and I told myself the ordinary sounds meant we were outside of whatever the hum was. We came out of the tree line onto the road before dawn. The road was empty, the grey pre-dawn light flat and colorless. I counted us. 5. Chobanu said Iosif would be out in a minute, that he must have gotten turned around slightly in the forest and would find the road shortly. We waited. The sky went from dark grey to pale grey to the first color of morning. The tree line behind us was still and silent. We waited for more than an hour past first light. Iosif Petre did not come out of the forest. Gergely saw the knife before anyone else. He had walked along the road's edge, looking at the ground, and he stopped at a pine tree, approximately 20 meters from where we had emerged, and stood looking at the trunk. Then he said my name. The knife was embedded in the pine trunk at shoulder height, the blade driven into the wood at a slight upward angle, perhaps 3 centimeters into the wood. The handle extended perpendicular to the trunk. I recognized it immediately, the distinctive wooden handle of the Solingen folding knife that Iosif had worn on his belt for all 4 days of the expedition, and that he had shown me on the first morning. The blade was bent, not broken, bent, at approximately 40 degrees from the straight line the handle described, as if enormous lateral pressure had been applied to the flat of the blade against a hard surface. The bend was smooth, not a sharp break, not a fracture point, but a continuous curve, as if the metal had been slowly deformed under sustained force. I pried the knife out of the tree with difficulty. The wood had already begun to move back around it. That knife is on the table beside this lamp. I have looked at it many times since we walked into company that morning, and I have held it and turned it in my hands, and I do not have an explanation for the condition of the blade, or for the tree it was found in, or for how it traveled from Iosif's belt to that trunk. I do not have an explanation. I have the knife. The priest was in the square outside the church when we reached Campeni. He watched us come down the road, and he counted us, visibly, and his expression was what it would have been, I think, if he had counted correctly and found the number was what he had been afraid it might be. He did not ask where the 6th man was. He brought us inside and gave us water and bread and sent someone to the next village for the gendarmerie. Marian Stancu sat in a chair in the church vestibule and looked at the floor. Chobanu sat with his hands on his knees and did not speak. Filipescu had stopped shaking by the time we reached the village, but was a color I had not seen on a living person before. Gergely went to the back of the church and prayed. I sat at the table the priest had set for us, and I opened this journal and I began to write. I have tried to set down what happened in the order in which it happened, and with the precision I can manage. I know that an inquest will have difficulty with parts of this account. I am not asking for those parts to be received as anything other than what I believe happened. I am a professional with 8 years of practice in these forests, not a credulous man, and I have no incentive to invent or to exaggerate what I have written here. Iosif Petra was 27 years old. He was engaged to be married to a woman in Bucharest, whose name I do not know. He was careful and attentive and curious, and he recorded things in a small leather notebook, and he helped in camp without being asked, and on the 3rd day of the expedition, he took his first boar cleanly, and he was glad about it, in the specific way of someone who has accomplished something that mattered to them. He was going to be very good at this kind of work. I believed that at the time, and I believe it now. The knife is on the table. I cannot put it away. I keep thinking I will, and I keep not doing it. I go to sleep, and I hear the hum. Not from the tree line, not from a forest, from inside my chest, where it always started, that vibration in the sternum before the ears could catch up and name it a sound. I lie in the dark, and it is there, in the chest, in the teeth, and I wait for it to stop the way I waited in the tent on those nights in the hollow east of Campeni. Sometimes it stops and I sleep for a short time. Sometimes I am still waiting when the window begins to go from black to grey. I do not know if it is still in the forest. I do not know if it stayed in the territory it cleared, or if it does something else when the territory has been surrendered. I do not know what it understood about any of us, about the 5 who got to the road and the 1 who did not, about what the difference was between those 2 categories. I know the sound of the canvas tearing. I know what the grip on the canvas edge looked like. I know the weight of a bent knife in my hand, and the way the pine wood had already started to close around it when I pulled it free. These are the things I know.